Hello, Homi. How are you?
Danny, great pleasure to be here.
Welcome to Economist on Zoom Getting Coffee. It's afternoon. I'm having a decaf. What are you having?
I'm just having my regular.
What's that mug?
This is a mug from the Australia G20. We deal with big issues, international events.
We're gonna get into that.
The world economy is going to change for the better.
Good. We're gonna get into that. But I was reading some of the things you've written in the past few weeks and months, and I want to start. I do want to hope to end with an optimistic note, but I want to read to you and those who are watching some of the numbers that I saw from one of your pieces, in which you're saying that because of COVID, we should expect 140 million people more going into extreme poverty, 130 million people having acute food insecurity. You talk about 1.2 million more children dying due to healthcare disruptions and so on. So you've been following poverty numbers for a long while. And have you seen such a shock as the one that we are going through, as big as this one? And is it, can these numbers go back to the trend they were before?
So this has been a massive shock, and in almost every country. So the size of the recessions that have been induced by COVID are quite unparalleled. And, in very large countries like India, we might have had a fall of something like 9.5% of GDP. And when you think that India was expected to grow by 7% of GDP, it was sort of on that kind of a growth trajectory. The delta is something like 16 percentage points. Massive.
Right. So this is something important for people who are looking at this, that it's not that India is like 9 points down, it's 16 points down, because it's what it didn't grow plus what actually degrowth. Exactly. So you're taking into account the trend, which is the right way, is how people measure it.
Exactly. So, I think when we look at COVID, what we see is actually a couple of different things. So in places like India, you have huge numbers of people, but I think most of us expect that India will rebound quite rapidly from the crisis and catch up. Maybe not all of the lost growth. It'll sort of delay India's progress by a couple of years, but ultimately it'll get back onto a very solid poverty reduction trajectory. So when we look at, say, India in 2030, the poverty numbers will be hopefully very low if we don't have even more shocks. So maybe not quite as low as they would have been without COVID, but still very low. Whereas if you look, on the other hand, at a country like Nigeria, big country again, 200 plus million people, you get a big shock. But Nigeria has had no dynamism and no growth in its economy. So when it has a big shock, the length of time that it takes to kind of recover is much, much longer. And the impact on poverty is therefore likely to be much, much more long-lasting and scarring. And one of the reasons why ultimately COVID will turn out to be a temporary shock in the economist sense for most places, but for a lot of poor people, it'll end up being a permanent shock.
So you've been working too on a topic that is very related, I would say, because when people leave poverty, they, I don't know if it's fair to say, they join the middle class.
Well, first they probably go through a phase of being like vulnerable between being extremely poor and middle class. I mean, there's still a gap, but yes, more or less, hopefully the trajectory is you move out of extreme poverty, you have a period where you're still rather vulnerable, that a shock like if you fall sick or something like that, might put you back into poverty, but then you escape from that into the middle class.
Right. So eventually a lot of the people who are in poverty today, or they will eventually transition into the middle class. And you've been doing some work on that, on the global middle class.
Yes.
Which I think it's breaking maybe some paradigms of what we think. Can you give us the elevator pitch of what you found by looking at the middle class, or by trying to define what the middle class is and looking at the data?
To me, I mean, this is one of the most fascinating topics of economics, because if you just think about what was the world like in 1820, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, you basically had a number of really poor people, essentially peasants in agriculture, and you had a tiny sliver of really rich people who were the nobility. There was no middle class, zero. So in the 200 years since then, from 1820 to 2020, the middle class today is by far the largest group in the world. You have far more middle class than you have below middle class, and far more middle class than you have rich. And so to me, it's fascinating. How did a group go from being nothing to the majority in a relatively short span of time? And I think many of us have some, thoughts about it. It's about obviously technology and the Industrial Revolution, and productivity growth in business and in manufacturing in particular. Also about education, but the key point is that you could have imagined a world where many of those same things were taken over by a few people in elites. I mean, that's what happened essentially in the Renaissance. There was a flourishing of technology, etc., but it was all captured by the people at the top. And when poor people got a little bit more money, they just had more children. And so the per capita increase didn't happen. But now we've got actually a real growth of the middle class. And that has really been what has propelled the global economy for such a long time. I mean, I know people, talk and think about technology on the supply side, but if you also think about how we manage to manage the demand side of things, it is because of the middle class. And ultimately, if you think about anything like scale economies, or why do we have these big digital platforms, etc., who uses the digital platforms? It's the middle class. If we didn't have a massive middle class, there'd be no Amazon, no Google, etc.
Is there a glass ceiling in the middle class? I mean, it seems like the middle class is growing, based on what you've told me, more because people who are poor are being able to escape poverty and join eventually the middle class.
Yes.
But there's very little of people who are at the top of the income days, also of the middle class, to go and become rich, or whatever we call them. That seems to happen less. So is there some sort of glass ceiling there?
No, I don't think so, because to the extent that many of those people who were in the middle class are small business owners, they are actually becoming rich. And when you look today, for example, at the innovators, the people who start all of these tech companies, they're all children of the middle class. Actually, this is true of history. If you go back to James Watt, who invented the steam engine, he was the child of somebody in the middle class. So the middle class, if you will, it's almost a place where, because you are sufficiently secure financially, you can afford to take some risks. So you get both some education and sort of knowledgeability, plus you get some risks, and you can start a great company. So all these people who are, now very, very rich are all people who started in middle class families.
And that's part of the reason you claim that this growing middle class is actually a growing engine of the economy.
Absolutely. So it's on both the supply side and on the demand side. On the demand side, it's because of scale economies and agglomeration. And on the supply side, it's because of risk-taking and the willingness to form new businesses.
Fascinating. I want to take us back to another topic. I want to take us back to poverty and development. And this is another topic that you in particular have played a huge role in defining or collective understanding of what development is. And I'm talking in particular about the Sustainable Development Goals. You played a big role in designing this, and basically it's a guide to the world on how and when should we achieve development. And here I want you to tell me your thoughts on that, where we are on that. So just for I'll just explain what this is for whoever is watching, but you can of course extend. We understand today that there are a number of goals that countries have to achieve in many dimensions, in terms of poverty, but also in terms of health and education and so on and so forth, in order to achieve development, to end poverty eventually, and which is what the ultimate goal. So you've done a lot of work on designing this and also measuring them. So tell us in a bit where we are and how do you think we get to where the world should get? It's a big question.
It's a big question. I'd say a couple of things have happened to change the nature of economics today compared to what it was 100 years ago. One of them, I think, is quite obvious. It's that there are what a lot of people have called planetary boundaries. I mean, we just now, especially if we want to be prosperous, which increasingly we are as a planet, we're just producing a lot of stuff. And whether we, you think about the planetary boundaries in terms of climate change and carbon emissions from all the power that we consume, or whether you think about it from the destruction of the oceans with all the plastics that we produce, the recycling, etc., we cannot have the same kind of growth path any longer that we traditionally did. So we've got to figure out a way of changing our understanding of what is successful, to incorporate things that aren't narrowly measured in GDP. We've always known that GDP is not the sort of the ultimate, but actually I would even bring it back to what we were discussing earlier about the middle class. The middle class doesn't just want material prosperity. They want to be able to enjoy life. So imagine you're sitting in China and you're in Beijing, and the year is something around 2010, and you can't go outside because the air is too thick to breathe. Your children start having asthma. You're dying younger because of respiratory diseases. That's not what you signed up for. That's not what the name of the game is. So it turns out that actually today, now that we've got more measurements, and WHO have just come out with some new standards about how damaging so-called PM 2.5 is. So these very fine particulate matters in the air, they actually penetrate deep into your lungs. They can get into your bloodstream. They can, in addition to respiratory diseases, they can give you cancer. Probably something like 6 billion people on the planet today are living in places which exceed the PM 2.5 safe threshold. So we have to change. That's point number one. point number two, I think, is that, again, when we look at the fact that in many countries that continued to have a rising share of people in the middle class, stopped having a rising share of people saying that they were happy. And it turns out that people don't just value material prosperity. This is something that's been brought home by COVID. They value being able to go out and have relationships with other people. I mean, people are social beings, and they feel an affinity for other people, senses of kinship. And that has to do with whether you call it social justice, whether you call it inequality, but something around the way in which our societies are organized. And then the last thing I would say is most people are terrified by war. That is the one thing they want to avoid. So now let me step back. At the time of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, in the development kind of ecosystem, there were groups that were working on the environment. There were groups that were working on peace. There were groups that were working on social justice and inequality. And there were groups that were working on, let me just call it, growth and efficiency. And they were each doing it separately, each by themselves. And so you had these fairly ridiculous conclusions like the Club of Rome saying, no more growth. I mean, that was never going to fly as a strategy for the planet. What the Sustainable Development Goals have done is acknowledged that you have these four very different pillars and said, let's actually put them all together and come up with a new concept, I believe, a new concept, which we shall call sustainable development. And this is more or less what it means. And then to articulate a vision of what a planet that pursues sustainable development might look like in 2030. And why 2030? Because it is far enough away to say we're going to need new technologies and new business models to get there and new institutions, but close enough not to be just dismissed as, I can't think about that now. I've got more urgent, short-term pressing things on my plate. So that's basically what the SDGs are. And I actually think it's been a very salutary device, because even today, when COVID hits and everybody says, oh my God, what do we do now? And we've got to change our economies. We actually have an answer. How do we want to change them? We want to change them to actually make progress on the SDGs. And we've had that conversation. Otherwise, today we'd be fighting one with the other about, you know, do we want this much environment or that much, or you know, all of these other things. And these different groups wouldn't be talking to each other.
But on that note, there is you know, as a development economist, when I teach development economics, we go through the several views of what development is, from the very simplistic, very clever, but very simplistic, quote unquote, view of capital accumulation 70 years ago. And then we start adding things like institutions, and we started adding things like education, and we add things, you know, more and more things, until now we also include, of course, the sustainability issues, which are critical and very important. So on the note on having this roadmap, as you're saying, that, you know, we know exactly what to do, how to prioritize all that, because we're talking about a lot of goals, a lot of things at the same time. And, you know, yeah, it's feasible to achieve all of them, but it requires a lot of effort, a lot of coordination, a lot of financing, which you also have written about. And we're now on crisis mode, and we have a way, you know, we have a benchmark to go back to, or a roadmap to go back to. but there are so many things to do. How do you deal with that, with that like complexity of what it means to achieve development today?
So let me say a couple of things. First of all, when you were describing what I would call traditional development economics, what I heard was we have something on the left-hand side, which we call your level of per capita income. And then we've systematically said, what are the drivers on the right-hand side that will lead to that improvement? Is it capital, human capital, physical capital, institutions, this, that, and the other? All right-hand side variables. What I would call the new sustainable development economics is that we've got a new concept of what's on the left-hand side. So in addition to per capita income, it's going to be things like carbon emissions. It's going to be things like social inclusion. It's going to be a whole range of other kinds of things. That's a very different kind of model. So that's point number one. Point number two is, I would just say, think of any country. How many, like the UK or the US, how many cabinet positions are there? And if you
30 plus.
30 plus. So the Sustainable Development Goals actually have 17 goals. The idea that it is somehow much more complex, it's not. It's simply a reflection of the way in which societies are politically organized. It's only much more complex because we used to think about development economics as only incorporating the Ministry of Finance, or maybe the Ministry of Finance and Planning, but a couple of economic ministries. Today's Sustainable Development Goals actually includes all of the various ministries. That's the difference. So I wouldn't say that it is more complicated. I would just say it's a better reflection of reality and of the way in which politics and societies are anyway managed, and it's trying to give coherence to that whole package rather than just focusing on one or two of those things. So then you get to the question of, so how do you prioritize? And I had the same response. How does one prioritize within a country? And the answer is you have a whole range of discussions about the budget and politics, and it goes through chambers and it's vigorously debated, and you have political contestation and all the rest of it. And that's exactly the way in which these priorities can and should emerge for the SDGs on a country by country basis, and below the country level on a city by city or regional basis as well.
So we're running out of time, Homi, but I think I want to ask you now about the end game of the SDGs, meaning the SDGs, as you said, are meant to be fulfilled by 2030. We are 9 years away. Are we gonna make it? And if we're not, what happens then?
So two things. One, any goal or target for a corporation when you set a strategy ought to be what I call a stretch goal or target. So the idea is to have a level of ambition that, really stretches you to do things better. From that point of view, my guess is that the SDGs will succeed.
That's a nice way to put it, because that's in the private sector. In the public sector, the goal is usually below what you can achieve, just to make sure that you achieve it.
But I would say, will we have a world in 2030 where we have more awareness and more understanding of climate change, environment and conflict and social inclusion? My answer is going to be yes. There'll be many more places across the world where this is there. And when you say, so what happens after 2030? The answer is going to be some of these things will now be more firmly embedded in just our daily lives. So, you know, today, one of the hottest things in private business is so-called ESG, environment, social, and governance markers and indicators. 10 years ago, you would have in things like the Economist magazine, something saying the only business of business is business. That was the famous kind of, you know, moniker. Gone. The biggest, most dynamic part of finance is social bonds and is environmental bonds. It's like, you know, finance for a purpose. So we're starting to recognize that we want finance, business, even academia, to really be focused on the problems of the real world and solving the problems of the real world. And I think that's tremendously healthy. So will we achieve all the numerical targets for the SDGs by 2030? Probably not. Will we be in a much better place than we would have been if we didn't have the SDGs? For sure.
On that optimistic note, I want to thank you, Homi, for your time. And really, you've been one of the minds behind these goals and development. And I think that actually the world owes you a lot, because I agree that I think that as we move on, we understand that we're much more aware of our surroundings as human beings than just ourselves. And I think that that's in part to people like you. So thank you for being in Economists on Zoom Getting Coffee, and I'll see you the next time.
Thank you, Danny.